don't send it out postal, so to speak.
I'm not sure exactly how this will work. I'm just going to get up and sit in the chair with you. Or I'll just hold this up. Well, thank you for coming. It's good to have you here. Feel free to continue to eat, and we're very glad you're here today. We're here with Dr. Harry Boyte, who is our guest lecturer, our Stark lecturer this year. And so it's been great to get to know Harry and his wife Marie Louise, there we go, who is from South Africa and is with us this evening, this afternoon now. So Harry is our Stark lecturer this year, and the Stark Lectureship, I always like to kind of talk about Stark a little bit. It was established in 1959 by Franklin Stark, who was a 1937 graduate of Dakota Wesleyan, and it was established to present publicly persons who demonstrate by the authenticity of their lives the connection between faith and works. And Harry has been very engaged in working to make the world a better place, we could say, through teaching people principles of civic engagement and the principles of democracy. Previous Stark lecturers are theologian Elton Trueblood, Naomi Tutu, the daughter of Bishop Desmond Tutu, Senator Mark Hatfield, columnist Cal Thomas, a writer Don Miller, who wrote a hugely popular book called Blue Like Jazz, and a personal friend of mine, philosopher and basketball enthusiast Jerry Walls, who was one of my professors in seminary. And for 60 years, the Stark Lectureship has brought together to Dakota Wesleyan authors and activists, philosophers, and some genocide survivors. So this year's Stark lecturer is Harry Boyte. Harry is a senior scholar of public work philosophy and the co-founder with Marie Ström, his wife, of the Public Work Academy. Harry founded the Center for Democracy and Citizenship at the University of Minnesota, which is that the Humphrey Institute? That's what I was.
It was then the Institute. It's now the Humphrey School.
The Humphrey School. Okay,
but it's
great.
For South Dakota's
Hubert Humphrey.
favorite son.
Right. Second favorite. Harry is also a well-regarded lecturer, writer, intellectual organizer on the topics of democracy and education, civic studies, public work, and organizing history. At present, Harry is a senior scholar in public work philosophy and at Augsburg University, and the co-founder of the Institute in Public Life and Work. Harry is also one of the key organizers for an organization called Braver Angels. In fact, I've gotten interested in Braver Angels through Harry. He let me know, or has kind of introduced me to this really interesting organization. And Braver Angels is an organization that seeks to help people have meaningful, friendly conversations over political and cultural divides. And so we're in the process, actually Dakota Wesleyan, the McGovern Center is kind of in an incubation stage, working on developing our campus and community as a Braver Angels community. I'm really excited about Braver Angels, and starting in what we're calling a soft launch. I point to Taryn because she gave me that idea of calling it a soft launch. And so both Fusion Church and the McGovern Centers are working together to help develop meaningful conversations. We had our first meeting a few days ago and zoomed in a Braver Angels representative, had a great organizing meeting, and starting in mid-May we will start having our critical conversations. They'll send a representative and help us to kind of have how to have meaningful, deep, rich conversations over areas of the kind of areas of cultural divide. So I really appreciate Harry for his work in starting Braver Angels and for getting us involved in it. I think it'll be a wonderful addition to our community life together. So Harry, I will turn things over to you at this point. And Harry just had a knee replaced 3 weeks ago, so he's a little bit...
Hobbling around.
That's right, that's right.
That's why I have a chair up here. You know, generous enough to find a chair.
Hello. I think I can get to the, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Just on the Braver Angels, I think you also would be all interested in what's called the College Debate Program, which is run by students, the Braver Angels College Debate Program, connected to a student organization called Bridge, which has 40 chapters, seeking to develop a kind of depolarized generational approach beyond the bitter fights on so many campuses. But the Braver Angels debate is really successful on college campuses. Students love it. There's no winner. First principle of the debate is there's not a prevailing side. There are beginning presentations that are well done on different sides of a resolution, and it could be working with Denison and University in Ohio, and they just had a student debate, which the students loved, about should there be fraternities on campus, a very hot topic. And it was people from different points of view, but the point of the debates are to learn to have thoughtful, careful conversations in which people articulate their deep beliefs in an effective way and also listen carefully to the other side without any expectation of converting people. But that's proving very, very useful, the Braver Angels Debates program. So I could certainly connect you with that if you want. Look, it's great to be at Dakota Wesleyan. I've long followed the career of George McGovern. As I said, I was at the Humphrey Institute. Joel said I was at the Humphrey Institute, and Humphrey came from Dolan, South Dakota, exactly due north of here. I'll talk about some of his work tonight. But more broadly, I'll also talk tonight about what I would call the tradition of the Prairie Commons, C-O-M-M-S. C-O-M-M-O-N-S, which are common things that communities build through what we call public work. So quilting bees and barn raising and care for the range, and there are all sorts of commons. South Dakota is full of commons built by the public work of the Civilian Conservation Corps in the New Deal. 30,000 young people were involved in building the park system in the state, as well as dams and forests and trees. And so we'll talk more about that. But Dakota Wesleyan and the small liberal arts colleges like Dakota were really central to this tradition. They embodied the values of work, of faith, of education, of expansion, of education that is personal and connects to people's lives and histories and possibilities. So it's really exciting for both Marie and I to be here. We were here looking at the Dakotas in the fall, September of 2020, because Marie's had a birthday and she comes from South Africa and she had never seen much west of the Mississippi. So we went to the Dakotas. If you want to see some pictures, tonight I'll show you some pictures. Okay, but today I'm going to talk about what we call student empowerment or civic agency. Call it civic agency. So that's a capacity to shape the world around you with others, and often others who are quite different. So it certainly involves a dimension of discussion, but it involves a dimension of work. So I'm going to give you some background on the idea of Civic Agency and tell you a couple of stories of groups of students we've worked with about this. So my own background as a young man was working in the civil rights movement for Martin Luther King's organization. My dad, who had been the manager of the Atlanta Red Cross, was a critic of segregated schools, and became involved in school desegregation, and in 1963 became involved in the CLC on the executive committee. So I was the lowly field secretary. I used to drive King to the airports and stuff. I played ping pong with him, but I wasn't on the executive committee in the famous deliberations about the future of the movement, but I heard secondhand. And I worked in something that I'll talk a bit about tonight called the Citizenship Schools. We had 900 citizenship schools across the South. There are two wonderful books I would recommend. One was by my boss many years later. She wrote a book. Dorothy Cotton was the director of the Citizenship Education Program of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Her autobiography is called If Your Back's Not Bent, the Role of the Citizenship Education Program in the Civil Rights Movement. And her phrase is from a speech King gave at the Dorchester Center, which people came to from all across the South to go back and create a citizenship school. Not a formal school, a church in a school in a church basement or a beauty parlor or community center, sometimes a school. There was a center called Dorchester, and 9,000 people came there over the 60s. And King gave a speech saying, if your back's not bent, nobody can ride on it. So it's the importance of acting with dignity. And citizenship schools taught nonviolence, taught black history, taught literacy, because a lot of the experiences of black people in the South kept them from voting because they were very arduous literacy tests, and numeracy. And it was inspiring to see people develop a new sense of hope and possibility as they heard stories from others and as they thought themselves about what Dorothy used to say is a first-class citizen. And she had a song she later sang. It was not created in the 60s, it was created later, but out of the movement called We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Nobody else gonna rescue us. We are the ones we've been waiting for. So if there's a spirit of the citizenship schools and of the civic agency work we've done, it's that song. People developing the capacity to take hold of their own lives and work with others to make change. And as I said, Dorothy Cotton's book is marvelous about the power of nonviolence and overcoming the tendency to hate people you think are being oppressive, or an amazing story of nonviolence, but also what it meant to develop the identity of being a first-class citizen. And government is not us, not them. Democracy is not way out there, it's us. We actually have the power to make change. There are several videos, she died a couple of years ago, there are several videos on Dorothy's life that I'll send you a link, Jill. I'm giving some talks to colleges around Dorothy Cotton's legacy. But here I want to talk about how we've adapted this. So the citizenship schools were part of the movement which is not well known. In his history of the movement, I've Got the Light of Freedom, the historian Charles Payne describes this as what he called the organizing tradition in the movement. What people think of when they think about civil rights were the big demonstrations and the March on Washington and the sit-ins and pickets. They played a role, but they were very different than the organizing tradition. What people think of is what he calls the mobilizing tradition of the movement. Mobilizing is when you have a target, you rally the troops, you go after them. It's often us versus them. And that was part of the movement. In this case, it was segregation, but actually the segregation itself, the way people went out of that in something like the March, were shaped by the organizing culture. Organizing had existed in the black community for generations. Payne tells the story of the young college-age students who went into Mississippi with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, thinking they were going to mobilize the people to go after segregation, and they discovered that actually they knew very little compared to the people in Mississippi, the black communities in Mississippi, who had been organizing, and not simply for changing communities, but also to build things, to build churches, to build schools. 1/3 of all the schools in the black community in the South were created by communities themselves. They were called the Rosenwald Schools. Historically, black colleges and universities, HBCUs, those were organizing dimensions of the black experience, which are not very well known these days, but they were tremendously powerful resources for developing people's capacity to work together and to build things and to envision a better future. So the citizenship schools grew out of that tradition, and Payne does a marvelous job of talking about it. Fast forward, well, in the 70s and 80s after the movement, well, I had the experience actually trying to do organizing myself. Martin Luther King assigned me to do organizing with poor whites. So one of the things that it's hard for people to imagine sometimes these days, but it certainly goes to braver angels, is that Dr. King and other leaders of the movement envisioned an interracial movement of the poor that would come after end of segregation. So when you think about poor whites in the South, you're thinking about people who generally today are for Trump and seen as the enemy of progressives or liberals, but actually there was never that sense at all. In fact, Dorothy Cotton invited a group of poor white segregationists to Dorchester Center to get a sense of what people were doing, and then she hired a recruiter. So it was much less categorical, in a sense. But organizing really is about developing the capacity not to see people as stereotypes or labels or in boxes, but as immensely complicated, full of possibilities for good and evil. Everybody has possibilities for doing good. You separate the sin from the sinner. That was one of King's main principles of segregation. Another is that if you have an opponent, the best way to deal with them is to figure out where they're coming from, not to try to humiliate them. Those are really important lessons for today. So there's a lot of skill development and capacity building in the organizing tradition. And when the University of Minnesota, the Humphrey Institute, asked me to come in 1987, the dean had seen an article, a review of an article, a book I did with Sarah Evans called Free Spaces. I was thinking a lot of free spaces as describing the citizenship schools, where people could develop agency and free intellectual life and talk to people who were different. I soon encountered a generation of students which was very different than the civil rights movement. In fact, most of my students at the Humphrey Institute, which is a public affairs school, graduate school, good school, they had done what was called the door-to-door canvass. Some of you may have done that. But the canvass started in 1974. As out of the environmental movement, to mobilize people by door-to-door action. It's a mobilizing approach par excellence. And you go door to door, you have a clipboard if you've ever done it. Anybody here done canvassing? You raise a little money, you get signatures on a petition. So you mobilize people, but it also has this formula that makes it work, which is you always have an enemy. So you get people mad. And you always define the issue as us versus them, good versus evil. And I'm not innocent. I defended the canvas because I thought it was a really powerful tool for environmental change. But when I came to the Humphrey Institute, I discovered it had really a downside. I mean, like 3/4 of my students, graduate students at Humphrey, had done the canvas, door-to-door canvas, all around the country. And virtually to a person, they hated the experience. It made them bitter and disillusioned and look at the world in a very good versus evil way, reduce people to stereotypes. So we started in our work, the dean asked me to start a democracy project, Harlan, Cleveland. we thought we better find other ways for young people to learn how to make change than simply mobilize. It's not really helping the country. It might help on a particular issue, but there's a lot of collateral damage. Eroding a sense of common citizenship, even the idea of working across differences. And that was what I saw that the generation was encountering, is the understanding of politics. So I'll talk more this evening about the understanding of civic life and a political action that was deep in the Dakotas, focused on work of common purpose, building things and solving problems together, really at the heart of community building. But here I want to give you a couple of stories and then open it up for some questions. So we had, the biggest thing we did was an initiative for K-12 students in which young people work as teams on an issue of public importance that they identify, they choose the issue. It's called public achievement. If you want to look it up, there's a Wikipedia site about it. And I wanted students, young people in lower grades and also in college to have the experience I had had as a young person, where I saw kids learning to make change and not to hate people who they disagreed with. So public achievement has teams of young people, and they're coached by college students usually, who work with them to develop the capacities to make change. And what we found very soon was what I should have known from the movement. Young people don't know how to make change. They don't know how to talk to people they disagree with. They don't know how to understand what we would call the everyday political cultures of their school or their college or their environment or their church. If they think something's wrong, they're just mad. So maybe they protest, maybe they shut up, but they don't have ways to make change. And that's pretty endemic, and it's pretty much spread across the society. And that's pretty much people know. If you're mad about something, you can either protest, mobilize your troops, mobilize. You can shut up and accept it and just be quiet. But the third way of taking effective action to do something constructive is really pretty unknown. And I would say that's what we call civic agency, and that's what we've done. So two examples. So public achievement has a lot of stories and some inspiring experiences. We found that young people actually, even really young people like third graders, love to feel powerful in making change about something they care about. Like, it could be on all sorts of things. It could be on bullying. It could be on recycling. It could be on lousy school meals. It could be on growing gardens. It could be on racial prejudice. It could be on the way gays and lesbians are treated. All sorts of things. They choose the issues. They just have to undertake them in ways that are nonviolent and make a public contribution. So if they want to go to the shopping mall as their issue, we say, well, just explain how that makes a public contribution. So actually kids know about what makes a public contribution. It's not being a consumer, it's being a producer, a creator. So we've had probably 200,000 young people in the United States be involved in public achievement over the last 30 years, and probably 5,000 coaches, 5,000 or 6,000 coaches in college. And we see a lot of impact. We have a lot of evaluation data. It really makes a difference with students' motivation and sense of self and efficacy and self-respect and belief in other people. And then it's adapted. So let me just tell you two stories that adapted public achievement. So we've had, the University of Minnesota has had hundreds of students learn the skills of what we call civic agency, organizing, not mobilizing. We have a great international coach named Dennis Donovan, who was a principal of a working class Catholic high school that we started in that really it flourished in, called St. Bernard. So we hired him several years after we started, and he's been helping spread public achievement and being a coach in many settings. But he also teaches a course at the university called Organizing for the Public Good. And students love it. And it's very diverse. I mean, as diverse as you could possibly imagine. You know, giant basketball players and women's soccer players and feminists and business people and military veterans, and I mean, it's just amazingly diverse. Everyone loves it. because they really want to know how to make change and also how to engage with people who are outside their own bubbles. That's what they talk about. So there are a lot of students in that course who do coaching and public achievement sites, and it's also spread to other settings. And sometimes, I started the course with Dennis, but in the last few years I haven't been able to do it with him, to many things, but I often have independent students who come out of Dennis's class. And 3 years ago, we had a student who was a star athlete, track runner, and she was going more deeply into the history of organizing and civic agency and so forth. And then Dennis was having some students in his class who were also a lot of athletes. In fact, he has to put a cap on the number of athletes because they would be flooded with athletes if he let it happen. Because they feel respected, you know, they don't feel like just athletes. So the women, my student and some of the women athletes in Dennis's class said, well, we've got a problem that we really want to figure out what to do about. Well, there's a lot of sexual harassment in the University of Minnesota's athletic programs. And of course, the giant university, 50,000 students, there's a huge athletic program. I mean, there are like more than 1,000 students on scholarship. And it's all different kinds of sports. So the young women said, we really think we have to do something, because the only thing we ever do is scream at the guys, you know, after practices or whatever. And it's really not working. It's not making any change. So they developed an approach that we would call organizing. And my student was a key organizer here. First of all, they decided to talk to the boys, the athletes. They had never talked to them. They just yelled at them. And they got a lot of insight into what was going on and why they did it and how they thought they were supposed to be tough guys and celebrity stars and stuff. But then they decided they wanted a different way of dealing with this issue. So, and Dennis helped with this because he's a very popular figure among the athletic department leadership. But the athletic department, to its great credit, decided to try something different. And the women students said that what the athletic department did around sexual harassment was just ridiculous. They had some old guy read something from the 1940s on how to be a good, upstanding person that people just went to sleep with, or they went crazy. So instead of that, they wanted to have a student-designed approach to dealing with sexual harassment. And one of the tools of organizing that we use is called civic deliberation. So they developed, and it needs to have a carefully moderated process, so they trained, with Dennis's help, and I was kind of on the side cheering, 70 athletes who they thought would be good in facilitating conversation. And they spent a whole day in conversation about the problem and the issues and the dynamics of sexual harassment. And this has become a model for some other colleges. Now, it requires a lot of background. It's not something you can just plop in as a program, so I don't know how well it's doing. But definitely it's changed the tone of the athletic program at the University of Minnesota. So another example, which is really the same thing, about students taking on responsibility and agency themselves for the problems in their lives. I mentioned that Marie and I are working at Denison in a citizen professional seminar I'll talk about tonight. And we've worked with the president, Adam Weinberg, for a long time. He was once dean of students at Colgate and now is at Denison. And Adam has been very interested in students learning how to take on the problems and conflicts they have themselves directly, rather than have them addressed by staff or dorm counselors or whatever. So not long after he came, in 2015, he asked us to start working with the student affairs staff, especially in the residence halls. And he worked with the staff, and they developed this vision of the residential halls becoming residential communities in which students would learn to be a neighbor to others and work through problems, rather than simply being housed in something that they paid money for, and learn to work through their differences. He had done some of this at Colgate, but he did in-depth work with the student affairs staff, so that they changed even the language, so it was residential communities, not halls. It was coaches, not residential, what do they call them? The people who were in the residential, RAs. Yeah, RAs. Advisors, yeah. So, you know, and about all sorts of issues, race, dirty dishes. And one of the projects that really struck me was around the problem of the party culture at Denison. It's a pretty strong fraternity and sorority system at Denison. And the party system makes often mostly women go crazy. They feel like they're not treated well in that system. But again, instead of doing a protest, a group of students in the residential communities who were learning these skills decided, first of all, to have conversations, what we call one-on-ones. Marie will talk about this tomorrow in her session. Meetings, personal meetings, to hear what people have to say with some of the leaders in fraternities. And they got together in what we call a civic deliberation that had an action-focused outcome. And the staff played roles mainly as coaching and observers. They didn't dominate. They didn't tell people what to do. And the students organized conversations between fraternity leaders and women leaders around the problem of party culture and what was going on, what were the issues, what were the controversies that put them on a board. And then they split into groups and they decided ways to take action on them. And that turned out to be very effective. In fact, I'm sure, I didn't talk to the people involved, but I'm sure it fed into the recent debate that a couple of weeks ago of Denison students organized around the issue of fraternities, which was much more multidimensional than simply pro or anti. It was what's going on, what are the good parts, how can we address some of the problems. So let me end here. This gives you a taste of what we mean by developing civic agency capacities and skills. It's a process. It's very different than a Facebook rally. It's not a quick thing. And it learns also very important lessons for our time when things are so fast and quick and stereotyped and labels. And it builds relationships that are based on, well, in religious terms, on the divinity in every person, that we all are made in the image of God, and we all have vast complexity, and also that's, of course, a fit with the nonviolent philosophy. So why don't I open it up? Sure.
If you're a student at a small college, what do you think the first step is in developing a change at your university?
First of all, it's a great question. Secondly, I would say find some other students who are interested, have same. You don't make much change by yourself. One of the principles of organizing, you need a team. And so when my student wanted to do something about sexual harassment, I said, well, find some other athletes to work on it with you. I would say find some support in the faculty and staff, so people who would be allies. And here there's a particular, I mean, I think probably small colleges are more likely to have a lot of faculty and staff like this than bigger research universities like Minnesota. But you do want people who really have a belief in the potential of students to make a difference in their own lives. Now that's not all, but it is, you can find. And I think, again, a teaching college like Dakota Wesleyan would have a lot of adults who would be supportive. And then, first of all, you know, you can read a little bit, like the book that I co-authored with with Marie is full of stories of public achievement, called Awakening Democracy Through Public Work. It's mainly about 2/3 of the book are about public achievement. Marie has a chapter she wrote on African work. So that gives you a sense how they did it. There's a manual around public achievement which has a lot of skills. There's an adult manual around public work that a big coalition in Eau Claire, Wisconsin put together called Clear Vision about skills. So I think there's some things to read, but then the other thing is you learn this stuff in practice. So having a group, maybe you call it the Dakota Wesleyan Civic Agency group or public work group or Arise, young people are rising. I mean, there are a lot of different possibilities. Names are important, so it has to be given some thought. And then work on it. Now, there's some skills that Marie will talk about tomorrow that are really useful here. For example, any effort you do, whether it's bullying or the first school, St. Bernard's 5th and 6th grade kids worked over 5 years to build a park in a neighborhood, a playground in a neighborhood that the adults thought was too dangerous. So there are a lot of skills involved in that. That didn't just happen. But things like power mapping, you figure out who might be key players to be connected with and talk to, and you do a map of the environment, and stuff like that. I think the one-on-one practice that Marie will talk about a lot tomorrow is really important. So that's just the beginning. But. Yeah.
So you talked about how it's sometimes hard to reason with people who disagree with you in order to make change. So what does that mean?
I missed the first part.
So you talked about how sometimes it's hard to reason with people who disagree with you. So what are some ways or things you say to
Well, so here, Braver Angels, our colleague who developed the process in Braver Angels, Bill Doherty, I'll talk about tonight a bit. He developed, he's a marriage counselor, and he developed marriage counseling as a public citizen professional. That's what he calls a citizen therapist. So at the heart of Braver Angels are basically skills that you find in marriage counseling. Like, you don't keep focusing on the other as the problem. You think, well, do I have any part of this problem? First, and secondly, you don't assume that you know what the other person really thinks. You will have views, but they're just your views. So you have to have ways of people surfacing stories and hearing each other and reflecting with each other. You need a mission that's built around, first of all, you build relationships. You don't focus on ideas you disagree with. So in Braver Angels, it's the first workshops are basically building relationships, and there's a process called one-on-ones where you just listen to where other people come from. And that does make a huge difference. But I think you're in a good position at Dakota Wesleyan because Braver Angels has a lot of these methods that are available. It's a really important question, though. Because at this point, as you know, people don't really try to figure out where other people come from on the other side. They figure out what's wrong with them and how they can instruct them in how to think correctly. And also to cancel them. I mean, it's really a corrosive culture that we have to change. We have to turn around. I do think higher education will play a crucial role in turning this around. Not only because of the experiences that students can have at higher education, in college, or in their classes, or in co-curricular, but also if they learn to translate those skills into their careers, this is what we call citizen professional, then you can talk about huge multiplier effects. Other thoughts? Yeah.
So you talked about listening and going door to door with issues, and I think much of that has been replaced with social media. Does your organizing course address social media and how to handle that space?
Yeah, well, of course, students are much better at figuring it out than I am. Yes, you have to deal with that. I think, the kind of the simplistic in a way, framework is that social media can't replace relationships, face-to-face relationships. It can supplement at best, and there are a lot of things social media can do, like Braver Angels has, in this COVID times, developed very effective national debates by Zoom, where people learn. I mean, it's kind of amazing how I think people hunger for a different kind of experience. So I was in the Braver Angels debate a couple of months ago, one of the people who presented in the beginning, and it was a debate on national service. Now, I actually have an unusual position on this because I really believe in the public work service of the New Deal, WPA and CCC and stuff. So I said I'd be in it, but I'd take a third position. But it was a resolution, everyone should have an experience of, every young person should have an experience of national service. And there are some quite eloquent proponents and opponents, and it's better not to have government do it, it's better to decentralize it, all sorts of points of view. On that Zoom meeting, at the end of it, there were hundreds of people in the participating audience, and they had some people ask questions and made comments too. But at the very end, they did a poll. And they found, the poll said, this just blew my mind, 96% of the people said that they had a much higher, not simply a little higher, much higher opinion of people who they disagreed with on this issue than at the beginning. So it shows that there are ways to use social media in a really constructive way. It has to be moderated. I mean, the Braver Angels debates, both the campus debates and the adult debates or general debates, have some ground rules. You don't talk ad hominem. You talk through a moderator. You say, Ms. Chair, I'd like to ask this question. You listen carefully. So there are ground rules. I think that's one of the principles of any kind of social media work. You need to figure out ground rules if you don't want it to just become a shouting match and make things worse. It's easy to make things worse. But then also, the other thing is they don't replace face-to-face. So those things, I would say. But I'd encourage you to look at some of the Braver Angels website is braverangels.org. There are examples of debates. There's a very interesting example of a CBS Morning News with Bill Doherty, is the therapist, taking family therapy to the nation. That's how the CBS phrased it. And it was a kind of person on the street, Trump supporters. This was Biden supporters, and then people who were independent, saying, what about polarization? Everybody agreed it was a problem. What do you think we can do about it? People would say, well, the other side is really terrible. So the reporter said, well, this guy I'm talking to, Bill Doherty, he's a marriage therapist. He's trying to figure out how we bring therapy to the nation. You don't say what's wrong with the other person. You say, do I have any part in this issue? And it was interesting. I mean, he had to keep repeating this to people. He had to challenge them. But finally they said, no, well, to be really honest, of course we have problems, and they had ways of talking about that. So I would say that's another way that media can help, just showing stories and examples like that. But it is a big problem. I think the social media can be very cancerous, and it's not only the misinformation, it's the labeling, it's the abstractions, it's the reductionism. But that's an advantage of a place like Dakota Wesleyan, because you have a small enough environment so people can get to know each other. Any other? What do you all think? Kansas City and Dakota. Does this make any sense? Can you kind of imagine yourself in some of this?
Yeah, I think it's hard just to kind of like, if there's people just like showing you out, start to change. Like, it's something that might take a lot of convincing, like, after hours, or like, in private, kind of like practicing to bring change to other people.
Yeah, well, it does take, first of all, you're exactly right, it takes practice. It's like learning. The organizing is like learning to play a trumpet. It takes a lot of practice to do it really well. You're not born knowing how to do it. And they're both private places and public places. One of the things we find in public achievement, and also in other kinds of public work, is that people need public stages, too. Not only private, but places where you're going to be anxious, and you're going to have to stretch yourself, and you're going to have to deal with your anxieties. And so there, I would say campus debate programs are often very good backgrounds to the public achievement, civic agency skills kids can have. But so can theater be, too. I mean, there are a lot of public performance kind of things where you have to learn to deal with being in a public world. Dakota, Wesleyan, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I was kind of just thinking, as far as numbers like scholarships, small school, like you don't want to step on anybody's toes.
Yeah. You know, there's the idea of these one-on-one meetings is really helpful. Because if you get to know people, you stop worrying about stepping on their toes so much. In a way, that fear comes from not really having a deep understanding of where people are coming from. And the one-on-one process can really help develop a much deeper, not only actually people you don't know, but one of the things we find, we did a session with faculty at Denison, and they said, you know, we've been in the department with these folks for years, and we thought we knew them, but we didn't know them very well. We didn't really go deep into who they are, what their story was, what their why was. So that's one way of dealing with that kind of anxiety. But again, it's a skill building process. There's no quick fix to it.
We like to use the phrase South Dakota nice.
Yeah.
So oftentimes I think our students don't want the conflict, or they assume conflict will come, so then they just don't want to go. So it's either to just not address issues, or take them to like social media where there's really no.
No, I think it's hard. But again, at Dakota Wesleyan, there should be more opportunities for people to interact. It is a matter of skill building. And there's a lot of skills involved in dealing with conflict well. Not either exploding or being quiet. It's like in both the student athlete and the party issues, students had to find a third way beyond screaming or being quiet, being nice. So I think that's really the trick, but it's also crucial.
Thank you, Harry.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Fantastic, and we are really in the process of starting Braver Angels. We're going to have our first debate sometime in May. So it's just going to be kind of a community debate, so we aren't going to be around. But we're going to be kind of practicing this, and then I'm really hoping to kick it off in October, where we have we'll have what we call a hard launch. So we do a soft launch now. We'll do our full launch, God willing, in October, and really start making this public, where we'll have topics and we'll do kind of formal debating on issues of public interest and conflict.
I mean, one of the things about we're in the community collaboration network, which Dakota Wesleyan is part of. We're talking a lot about how to enrich the deliberative practices in Braver Angels, which are essentially dialogical, with public work. How can people work together with people who are different around common projects? Because that's the way to deepen the process and have large impact. So you could be a pioneer in that too.
Yeah.
It's happening at Denison. I mean, the faculty are all talking about how to do projects together or to make visible projects they are doing.
Right. Yeah, and the thing that's been interesting to me is that, you know, issues that can actually be divisive, when you have these kind of conversations, you can find kind of an odd friendship that develops. You don't just kind of tolerate the person. You really like them. You may disagree, but you appreciate their perspective in the way that I think.
And recognize that people have different talents,
Yeah.
different ways of knowing. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's great.
So thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.